The lights inside the Manhattan studio dimmed, casting a dramatic glow across the stage. In the center sat Robert De Niro, his iconic scowl etched deep into his features, dressed in a sharp black suit. His presence alone carried decades of Hollywood prestige, and the audience buzzed with anticipation. Tonight wasn't supposed to be a battle, at least not at first. De Niro had agreed to an open forum discussion with younger political voices, meant to be a generational dialogue. But when Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old rising star and White House press secretary, stepped onto the stage wearing a striking navy blue blazer and a small silver cross around her neck, the atmosphere shifted sharply. De Niro's eyes narrowed the moment she walked in. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, a subtle move that somehow still oozed disdain. He had prepared, or so he thought, to lecture this kid about morality, politics, and America's real values. Karoline, on the other hand, moved with calm precision. She smiled warmly at the host, briefly nodded toward De Niro, and then took her seat across from him, legs crossed, posture unwavering. The host, sensing the tension already crackling between them, smiled nervously. "We're here tonight to bridge generations, to understand different perspectives," he said, gesturing between them. "Mr. De Niro, Miss Leavitt, let's talk about the America you see." Karoline leaned forward slightly, attentive, respectful, ready. De Niro smirked, adjusted his microphone, and struck the first blow. "You're what's wrong with America today," he said, his voice gravelly, heavy with contempt. "You're too young, too naive, too brainwashed to even know it." The audience gasped, a sharp intake of breath cutting through the studio. Cameras flashed. The host's face froze into a tight smile. Karoline didn't flinch. She merely smiled. That kind of tight, knowing smile that said, "I was ready for this." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, leaned back slightly, and simply replied, "We'll see who really understands America, Mr. De Niro." The battle lines were drawn. The temperature in the studio climbed. Viewers across the country leaned in toward their screens. No one was leaving their seat. The night was about to become unforgettable. Robert De Niro leaned forward, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "You represent everything that's wrong with this country today. Blind loyalty, shallow patriotism, empty slogans," he said, waving a dismissive hand at Karoline. His tone was dripping with condescension, like a professor scolding an unruly student. The audience stirred, sensing the rising heat. Karoline sat perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in her lap, the silver cross around her neck catching the light. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even blink. She let him speak. It was a deliberate choice, one she had learned through countless political battles. Let your opponent talk themselves into a corner. De Niro, mistaking her composure for weakness, pushed harder. "You wear that cross like it means something," he sneered, gesturing toward her neck. "But it's just for show, just like your so-called patriotism, just like your so-called principles." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The host shifted nervously in his chair, glancing at Karoline, waiting for a reaction. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she slowly reached up and touched the cross gently, a silent, defiant move that drew a murmur from the crowd. The moment was small but electric. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't emotional. She was planning. De Niro, emboldened by her silence, launched into a full monologue, a brutal condemnation of her generation, her career, her values. He listed grievances like bullets from a machine gun, throwing out phrases like brainwashed, childish, delusional. Each insult sharpened the blade he thought he was wielding against her. But Karoline was sharpening her own blade, quietly, methodically. She waited. And when he finally paused, breathing heavily, certain he had humiliated her on live television, Karoline leaned forward, her voice low but crystal clear. "Are you finished, Mr. De Niro?" she asked, her words slicing through the tension. The audience fell utterly silent. De Niro leaned back, smirking. For now? Karoline smiled faintly, the smile of someone who had just let her opponent make a fatal mistake. Good, she said, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. Because it's my turn now. The room shifted. You could feel it, a ripple in the air, an almost physical tension. Everyone leaned in closer, holding their breath. They all knew something was about to happen, and no one, not even Robert De Niro, was ready. Karoline straightened in her seat, her hand lightly brushing the cross at her neck, not as a shield, but as a sword. Her voice, when it came, was even and unwavering, commanding the room without needing to shout. "Mr. De Niro," she began, locking eyes with him. "You built a career playing tough guys. You speak about loyalty, honor, and principles on screen. But off-screen? You sit here insulting someone for daring to believe in something bigger than herself." The audience stirred. De Niro's smile tightened. "You accuse me of wearing my faith and my patriotism like accessories?" Karoline continued, her voice slicing through the air. "But let's talk about costumes, Mr. De Niro. You made millions pretending to be heroes. I'm standing here living it." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the host leaned forward, sensing the shift. Karoline's gaze sharpened, her words picking up speed like an unstoppable force. "You say my generation is lost," she said. "Maybe because we stopped looking to Hollywood for our heroes. We don't need actors to tell us what America means. We live it. We work for it. We fight for it. Not in front of cameras, but in everyday life." De Niro shifted in his chair, his posture stiffening. "And you," Karoline pressed on, her tone harder now. "You sit there, surrounded by lights and applause, lecturing about struggle and sacrifice. But when was the last time you lived without a script, without makeup, without someone cleaning up your mistakes behind the scenes?" The silence was deafening. "You called me just a kid," Karoline said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his. "Maybe that's true. But here's what you don't understand. This kid can stand here, without a script, without a director, and without fear. You?" She smiled faintly. "You can't even face a simple question without hiding behind anger and insults." The studio was frozen, breaths held, eyes wide. "And one more thing," Karoline said, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that somehow carried across the entire room. "This cross? It's not for show. It's a promise, a reminder, and it scares you, not because it's fake, but because it's real. Because it stands for something you forgot a long time ago." Boom. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was felt. Deep and seismic. De Niro opened his mouth to respond but found no words. His face flushed red, caught between fury and embarrassment. He looked smaller now, diminished under the glare of the truth. Karoline leaned back, calm, composed, victorious. The young woman he thought he could humiliate now towering over him without even leaving her chair. The audience sat there, stunned, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a surgical dismantling, slow, methodical, devastating. And it was far from over. The host shifted nervously in his chair, sensing the studio had just flipped, not because of a viral moment, but because of something deeper. Authenticity. The one thing no Hollywood legend could fake. The camera cut to the audience. Many leaned forward, jaws slightly open. Even those who entered the night ready to cheer for De Niro now sat stunned by Karoline's quiet fire. De Niro, realizing the silence was working against him, tried to regain his footing. "You think a few words make you a hero?" he barked, waving a hand dismissively. "I've been fighting for truth longer than you've been alive." Karoline didn't flinch. She waited, letting the desperation in his voice hang in the air. "You confuse fame with leadership," she said calmly. "You confuse being loved for playing someone else with actually standing for something yourself." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "You fought for truth?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Mr. De Niro, when you slander millions of Americans from the safety of award show podiums, was that fighting for truth? Or just preaching to rooms full of people paid to clap? De Niro opened his mouth to retort but found himself stuck, blinking rapidly. And when you mock faith, she added, her voice low but steady, when you insult people for loving their country, are you fighting for them or fighting to stay relevant to a shrinking audience? The camera zoomed in. De Niro's lips pressed into a thin line, his hands twitching on the armrests. Karoline leaned back, giving the audience a moment to digest the brutal precision of her words. This isn't about me, she said, turning slightly to address the audience directly. It's about all of you. Everyone who's been laughed at, written off, called backward because you dared to believe in something. Faith, family, freedom. The studio, once dominated by celebrity awe, now buzzed with quiet agreement. And if standing for those things makes me just a kid, Karoline said, flashing a faint smile, then maybe it's time for the adults in the room to grow up, the audience erupted. Not a polite golf clap, but a spontaneous, heartfelt applause that rolled through the studio like a wave. De Niro sat back, blinking, as if struggling to comprehend the shift. The host leaned in, trying to salvage the show. "Mr. De Niro," he said quickly, "your response?" But De Niro simply shook his head, a wry, bitter smile forming. "Let the kid have her moment," he muttered. Karoline didn't gloat. She simply sat there, composed and dignified, as the audience made it clear. Tonight, experience didn't defeat youth. Pretend toughness didn't beat real conviction. Fame didn't drown out authenticity. Karoline Leavitt had just rewritten the script, live, unscripted, and unforgettable, and the night was just getting started. The host cleared his throat, desperately trying to reset the energy in the room. All right, he chuckled nervously. "Mr. De Niro, surely you have something to say." De Niro leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His face was flushed, the studio lights reflecting off his forehead. "You think you're clever, kid," he growled, voice low. "You think one moment on TV makes you right?" Karoline didn't move. She simply waited, letting him struggle through his defense. "I've seen more history than you've read about," De Niro continued, stabbing a finger into the air. "I know what America really looks like. It's broken, and your side broke it." A few claps sounded from the far left section of the audience. It felt forced, thin. Karoline picked up her mic, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "America isn't broken," she said steadily. "It's bruised, it's tired. It's been mocked and beaten down by people who claim to love it but use their platforms to spit on it." She stood up slowly, her posture commanding yet calm. "And if you think fighting for the dignity of working families, for free speech, for faith, if you think that makes me what's wrong with America, then maybe you're not the hero you think you are." The audience erupted again, louder this time. De Niro leaned back, visibly rattled. He hadn't expected her to push this hard, this effectively. Karoline wasn't finished. She reached into the folder on the table and pulled out a printed page. "You want to talk about brokenness?" she asked, holding up the paper. "Let's talk about the communities you claim to champion, the ones where crime has soared, businesses have closed, schools have failed, while Hollywood lectures them about how to live." The audience gasped. Some even stood up. De Niro tried to interrupt, but Karoline spoke right over him, her voice clear and cutting. "You sit in mansions, Bob. You fly private jets. You live behind gates. And you have the nerve to call everyday Americans out of touch?" The studio lights almost seemed to dim, focusing all attention on the fiery 29-year-old standing alone against a Hollywood giant. De Niro's hand trembled slightly on his water glass. Karoline gave a faint, almost sad smile. "You called me just a kid." "Maybe I am," she said, her voice softening for the first time. "But if believing in America, unapologetically, makes me childish, then call me a kid forever." The crowd exploded. Cheers, whistles, even some chants of, "Karoline, Karoline!" The host gave up trying to control the moment. The night now belonged to her. De Niro sat silently, face hardened, but defeated. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a yell. It was worse. It was the truth, and it had landed like a hammer. Karoline didn't sit back down. She stayed standing, letting the silence weigh heavy in the studio. Her deep blue eyes scanned the audience, not seeking approval, but challenging them. "I grew up in a house where the American flag wasn't just a decoration," she continued, voice strong. "It was a reminder that freedom isn't free, that it's fought for every single day." She pointed subtly toward De Niro without even looking at him. "And it wasn't fought for so Hollywood millionaires could sneer at the people who make this country work." The audience's reaction was electric. Applause, cheers, and even a few whoops filled the air. People started recording with their phones again, knowing they were witnessing something different, something raw. De Niro leaned back in his chair, visibly shrinking from the force of her words. Karoline took a step forward, speaking directly to the camera now, to the millions watching at home. "You can mock me, you can call me a kid, you can laugh at my beliefs, but you know what you can't do?" She paused, letting the tension stretch. "You can't erase the truth." The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the sheer intensity of her conviction. De Niro shook his head in frustration, muttering something under his breath. But Karoline ignored him completely. She walked slowly toward the moderator's table and placed her printed facts sheet down on the surface with a deliberate thud. "You said America's broken, Bob. I say it's wounded by the arrogance of people who think they're too good for the country that gave them everything." The moderator finally found his voice, stammering, "Miss Leavitt, we should probably—" Karoline raised her hand slightly, silencing him with nothing but presence. "I'm not done," she said calmly, sending a ripple of awe through the room. Then she turned back to De Niro. "And you're right about one thing, Bob," she said with a faint smirk. "I am different from you." She leaned in just slightly, voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper only the microphones could catch. "I don't talk down to America. I stand up for it." The crowd erupted. It wasn't polite applause anymore. It was a full-on standing ovation from half the studio. Whistling, clapping, shouts of "That's right" and "Go Karoline" echoed off the walls. De Niro sat frozen, blinking rapidly, his hands twitching on the table. The moment was gone, completely, irreversibly. Karoline hadn't just turned the tables, she had flipped the entire room, and America was watching. Robert De Niro straightened in his chair, his face tightening. He wasn't used to losing, especially not to someone half his age on live television. "You're just a mouthpiece," he said, his voice harsh and brittle. "Another puppet shouting lines fed by politicians." The words were meant to sting, to reduce her to nothing. Karoline didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a curious specimen under glass. When she spoke, her voice was devastatingly calm. "I wish I was just a mouthpiece," she said, eyes glinting. "It would be easier than thinking for myself. Easier than standing here, alone, facing a legend who can't handle being challenged." The audience buzzed, a low, almost electric hum of anticipation. "But unfortunately for you," she continued, stepping forward again, "I'm not reading from a script. I'm not parroting someone else's pain for applause." Her hand lightly touched the small cross necklace resting against her chest. A move so natural, yet so symbolic, the cameras immediately zoomed in. "I've lived what I believe," she said. "And unlike you, I don't use my platform to tear down the country that gave me the right to stand here." De Niro's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Karoline, sensing the collapse, delivered the final blow. "You talk about struggle like it's a performance. For me, and for millions of Americans, it's real life." The crowd gasped audibly. This wasn't just a takedown, it was a dismantling. De Niro glanced toward the moderator as if pleading for rescue, but none came. The moderator simply watched, wide-eyed, like everyone else. Karoline lowered the microphone slightly, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "The coup de grace. You wanted a performance tonight, Bob? Sorry, I only do reality. The room erupted. Chairs scraped the floor as audience members leapt to their feet. Shouts, whistles, applause thundered through the studio. A few younger attendees even began chanting, "Karoline! Karoline!" De Niro sat back heavily, defeated. No clever comeback, no smirk, only silence. Karoline gave a final, respectful nod to the audience, then turned gracefully toward the camera, her face serene but fierce. She had come into the lion's den and left the lion whimpering. The studio doors barely closed behind Karoline Leavitt before the internet exploded. Clips of the moment she silenced Robert De Niro began flooding social media like wildfire. One TikTok clip of her saying, "I only do reality," crossed 500,000 views in less than an hour. On X, the hashtag #Caroline owns De Niro trended faster than anyone anticipated. Fox News replayed the segment on a loop. Conservative talk shows called her the new face of unapologetic patriotism. Even moderate outlets couldn't ignore the spectacle. New York Post's front-page headline screamed, "Karoline Leavitt crushes Hollywood royalty." Meanwhile, liberal outlets struggled to spin the disaster. CNN analysts tried to frame De Niro as gracious under pressure, but viewers saw the truth. A legendary actor, floundering and outmatched by a sharp, relentless 27-year-old with a silver cross shining on her chest. At the White House, celebrations quietly broke out among Karoline's closest allies. One senior advisor even joked, "Karoline just did more in 7 minutes than some senators do in 7 years." Donald Trump himself couldn't resist. He posted on Truth Social, "Karoline Leavitt just destroyed Robert De Niro and defended our great country while doing it. So proud. A future star." Within minutes, the post racked up hundreds of thousands of likes and shares. Karoline, sitting in her modest office back at the communications wing, watched the chaos unfold with a quiet smile. She didn't need to shout about her victory. America was doing that for her. Her husband entered the room, beaming with pride. "Everyone's talking about you," he said, holding up his phone filled with notifications. Karoline shrugged modestly, but couldn't suppress a grin. "It wasn't about me," she said. "It was about standing up for all the Americans they sneer at every day." Later that night, while the media still buzzed, Karoline made one final post on her personal account. "Never underestimate the strength of faith, truth, and conviction. Thank you, America. We're just getting started." The comment section erupted in support. Soldiers, farmers, students, mothers, factory workers, all thanking her for saying what they felt but couldn't always voice. Robert De Niro, meanwhile, canceled a scheduled interview on MSNBC. Sources close to him said he was taking time to reflect, but for Karoline Leavitt, reflection wasn't on the schedule. She had just redrawn the political map, and she was ready for whatever came next. In the days following her clash with Robert De Niro, Karoline Leavitt's name wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Major conservative outlets dubbed her America's new Lionheart. Independent podcasts praised her composure, calling it a masterclass in speaking truth to power. Even late-night comedians, typically hostile, struggled to mock her without sounding petty. But it wasn't just media buzz. A movement was forming. Young conservatives, long criticized as too soft or too apologetic, saw in Karoline a new standard: fearless, articulate, and impossible to bully. High school students in Texas painted "I only do reality" on banners at their football games. Veterans in Ohio handed out small silver cross pins as symbols of standing tall under pressure. Mothers in Michigan shared her speech across PTA groups saying, "This is the kind of courage we want to raise." Meanwhile, Democratic strategists held frantic meetings behind closed doors. One leaked memo from a senior advisor read, "We underestimated her. Leavitt has reshaped the battlefield. Prepare to counter, or risk losing Gen Z and millennials for good." At CNN headquarters, there was visible tension. Producers debated whether to even show clips of Karoline anymore, knowing each broadcast only seemed to boost her popularity. Some hosts quietly admitted off-camera, "She's got that Reagan energy, defiant yet relatable." Meanwhile, Karoline stayed calm. No gloating, no endless interviews, no world tour. Instead, she returned to work, prepping for the next White House briefing, sending emails, writing new speeches. Her motto remained the same: Let your wins speak louder than your pride. But behind the scenes, major offers began pouring in. Think tanks, political committees, even book publishers wanted a piece of her story. Invitations to keynote at major conservative conventions flooded her inbox. Her team knew this wasn't just another media cycle. This was a shift. Karoline had become more than a political figure. She was a symbol of grit, of faith, of the unwillingness to be bullied into silence. And those who once laughed at her now scrambled to find ways to neutralize her rising influence. But it was too late. The American people had seen something real, and they weren't about to let it go. 1 week after her historic showdown with Robert De Niro, Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage at the Freedom Forum in Dallas, Texas. Thousands had gathered. The energy was electric, not from anger, but from hope. Wearing a simple black dress and her ever-present silver cross necklace, she approached the podium. No teleprompter, no scripted lines, only conviction. She paused for a moment, letting the crowd settle. Then, her voice rang out. Steady, powerful. We live in a time where insults pass for arguments, and silence is mistaken for wisdom. But the truth is louder than any celebrity's mockery, and the future belongs not to those who whine, but to those who work. The crowd erupted. Veterans stood. College students cheered. Mothers held their children tighter, knowing they were witnessing something rare. A leader being born, not manufactured. Karoline continued, pacing the stage. They tried to humiliate us. They laughed at our faith. They sneered at our love for this country. And still, we stood. Still, we spoke. Still, we rose. Her words were fire, and the nation felt it. Television broadcasts couldn't spin it fast enough. Social media flooded with clips of her speech, tagged number Rise with Karoline. Even longtime skeptics admitted, this isn't just about politics anymore, it's about character. Meanwhile, Robert De Niro, once towering and untouchable, faded quietly into the background. Not defeated by hate, but overshadowed by something more powerful. Hope. Karoline didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to launch attacks. Her strength was in her example. And America noticed. As Karoline exited the stage that night, an elderly woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, handing Karoline a small, wrinkled American flag. "My husband fought for this country. You fight for it too, with words and courage." Karoline clutched the flag to her chest, emotions flooding her heart. This was why she stood up. Not for fame, not for revenge, but for them. For all who still believed that truth, dignity, and faith could outshine even the darkest mockery. And as the lights dimmed on the Freedom Forum stage, one thing was clear. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just defending the future. She was the future.